And when we look at test construction, there's a few things that we really want to look at. And I'm going to go there. Tests are constructed to elicit evidence of student learning in relationship to specific feedback, instructional, not feedback, but instructional objectives. Achievement tests, which are ones that are looking at how well you achieved, should be constructed in keeping with 6 principles shown on the next slide. When we look at it, the table of specifications is what every teacher should do when you're making a test. Helps you plan your instructional objectives. Like if you look at a textbook, or if you get a textbook with a bunch of test items, they'll have a table of specifications. So when we're talking about multiple choice tests or selected response items, you should have about 4 or 5 correct just answers that you have, 4 or 5 answers, 1 correct response and 1 plausible answer, and we call that a distractor. So when we're talking about multiple choice, teachers rely on multiple choice a lot. They're pretty reliable when we do that, when we use them. And one of the reasons that we would like to use them is because of their reliability, plus they're easy to score. So when we look at writing multiple choice tests, you want to make the STEM sufficiently specific to stand on its own without qualifying anything else. So it's kind of like you don't say, what are you talking about? So sometimes like you might say applied behavior analysis can be, or applied behavior analysis. And so it's just not enough to hold it there. What is the main emphasis of modern classrooms who use applied behavior analysis? See how that's much more like the kids, there's so many different answers. If you say applied behavior analysis, there could be a ton of different answers. But when you give it that a stronger stem, like what is the main emphasis of modern classroom use of applied behavior analysis, then it helps the kids be able to hone in on the information that they're looking for. You want to avoid long and complicated stems, like you don't want them to be like a paragraph long, because the purpose is to measure the student's ability to deal with information. When they're too wordy and stuff like that, kids usually get lost in the STEM and they don't really know what you're asking. The STEM in every choice in the list of potential answers ought to fit grammatically. A lot of times people will get this wrong because they won't do is/are, and the answer will be a plural answer, and so they'll realize because of the way the STEM is written that it should be a plural answer. I mean, the STEM is written plural, so they'll know it's a plural answer, and they put some singular stuff in the answers. Take special care in using the no exception words such as never, all, none, or always. These words are most commonly found in incorrect statements because the requirement is no exception usually makes the statement wrong. So it's hard because kids get kind of tricked up on that. You can use except sometimes because then you're going to, when you'll say like which of the following is an example of applied behavior analysis, or all of these are examples of applied behavior analysis except, because then you know it's like one of those ones where you have too many answers and you're like, well, how can I do this? And then you'll put something in there that makes sense, but it really isn't. Also, you want to avoid making correct choices that only one that is qualified for. It should be neither the longest nor the shortest alternative. I'm going to tell you this if you're taking another test. If you don't know the answer, pick the longest one. If they're all long, sometimes you want to pick the shortest one. Do not use items that can be answered on the basis of information contained in another test item. And you know this happens. You get all excited because you skip that question, you don't know what it is, and then about 10 questions later, it'll give you the definition of it, and the question above that was, what is the definition of it? You're like, oh yes, excuse me, and you can go back and do it. After a test, discuss the items with the student and note their interpretations of the wording in each. So like, was there anything that was confusing about it? Do not include a choice that is transparently absurd. Like you can't think of the fourth one. You got A, B, and C, and they're all pretty good, and you can't think of one. So you say, like, my dog ate it. Something stupid that kids are like, really? You also want to list choices vertically rather than side by side, because sometimes kids get confused about which way it goes. Does it go A, B, left to right? Or does it go A and then B down and then C up and then D? So sometimes kids will pick the wrong A, B, C, or D just because of where they're situated. So you want to make sure that they all go down vertically. Use word structure that makes the stems agree so that they make sense when you're reading them as a whole sentence. Avoid repeating the same word or phrases in the stem and in only one alternative. So like every single one of them pretty much says the same thing except for one of them, because then you can pretty much throw out that one. Avoid overusing the same letter position for the correct answer. Like you don't want to make them all A. That would really mess with the kid's head, because you know, like they would go, oh, why I've only had marked on A. Oh my gosh, why would I do that? So those are some of the basic things that we would look at for multiple choice, and we're going to go through them each. So multiple choice, true, false, completion, matching, short essay, and problem solving. So I'm going to go through those real quick. Oh, I thought I did. Hold on. True, false are not the greatest test questions in the world as well, because a kid has a 50-50 chance of getting it right or wrong, so you don't always want to put in true, false. It's not a bad thing to use for a pre-test, because even if they're just guessing, they only have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. Completion sentences are actually highly accurate, like a fill in the blank or a completion. Those are really highly accurate. The advantage of completion items is that they can reduce the element of test wiseness to nearly zero. So if I said the capital of Maine is, and then I put a blank, the kid's going to have to know what the capital of Maine is. But if I put the capital of Maine is A, Sacramento, B, Augusta, C, Juneau, or D, Boston, you're going to go, Sacramento, no, Sacramento, California, can't be that. You go, Augusta, maybe there's an Augusta, Georgia. Juneau, oh wait a minute, Juneau's in Alaska. And then you go Boston, everybody knows Boston's in Maine, Massachusetts. So you're going to go, oh, B, Augusta. So they have a 1 in 4 chance of being able to get that right, and they can eliminate a lot just by their prior knowledge. So if you did the capital of Maine is blank, you would definitely know that they knew that Augusta was a capital of Maine. The same thing goes with math problems. If you just have open-ended or a blank math problem, if you give them choice A, B, C, D, they can actually work the problem backwards and try and fit the answer in to see if it's correct. When you do matching questions, which are a good way to do comprehension, to figure out comprehension, the comprehension level, when you do matching, you always want to make sure that the answers that you have are always more than your stems. So if you have 15, like presidents, and then you want to know what years that they served as president, you want to have more years than you have presidents. Short essay is not a bad thing to do as well. It provides a question for the student to answer, and the answers may range from a sentence or two to a paragraph. It's usually long essays are more than that. They usually will be 5 paragraphs to like over a page. But if you have a short essay, it's usually a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs at the most, maybe 100, 150 words, no more than that. Although they differ in length, their scoring should be the same. You should have a good idea, and the question should be written well enough that the kid knows what you're looking for. If you have an open-ended essay, such as discuss the role of the Prime Minister in Canadian politics, they can talk all about like hosting parties, ribbon cutting ceremonies, blah, blah, blah. You could do all kinds of really generic kinds of things. And even if you put 3 out of 5, then you wouldn't. But the kids could still get it right and argue that they were correct. But if you wrote in 5 paragraphs or less, identify 3 ways in which the Canadian Prime Minister and the U.S. President differ in their obligations to their respective constituencies, then that would be very specific. And then it's 3 out of 5. Identify 3 ways of which they could do in 5 paragraphs. So you're going, okay, I'm looking for 3. So while I'm grading it, I'm going 1, check, 2, check, 3, check, so that I know whether or not the child's going to be able to get all their points on it. Problem-solving items is another one that we look at a lot. And when we look at problem-solving assessments, they require students to organize, select, and apply complex procedures. That would be something like you're set up a scientific experiment, when kids set up scientific experiments. So that you want the kids to be able to, they have to know the background knowledge of what it takes to set up an experiment. They have to know the procedures, what it takes to put up an experiment. And then you can also even have them do an hypothesis. So there's just so many different pieces that go along with it. Or you can give them a hypothetical, and then they have to pull out the relevant information from that hypothetical in order to solve the problem, which is also another good task. When we look at achievement tests, which is most of the things that we're giving are achievement tests, they measure clearly defined learning objectives that are in harmony with their instructional objectives, so they should be matching. Measure a representative sample of a learning task included in the instruction. Let's say you spent 3 weeks on Martin Luther King, and then you spent 1 week or 3 days on Gandhi. You're doing like, famous, inspirational leaders. And then you get the test, and there's 9 questions on Gandhi, and there's 2 questions on Martin Luther King. There is not a match. The sample in the test do not match the amount of time that you were given to learn that task. So include the test types items that are most appropriate for measuring your desired outcomes. Like I said, matching works really well with comprehension. Essay is when you're trying to get at some of those nuances where you can see where kids are making those connections. You don't get to that higher level thinking very well with a multiple choice question. Include the types of test items that measure your learning outcomes. If all of your learning outcomes are at the low level of Bloom's taxonomy or at level 1 of DOK, then multiple choice is going to be good. A matching is going to be good. Maybe even a fill in the blank because it's all factual knowledge. But if you're trying to get to some of those higher level thinkings like creating and evaluating, then you might have a kid that says, make an argument for something. And that argument is going to be pretty open-faced because they're going to have to support it by facts, but they might not be the 3 facts that you're thinking of. They also should fit a particular use that will be made of the results. So if you're doing this for grading, remember we have to be able to sort kids by grades unless you want to give everybody A's, which is okay too, but not really because there's always going to be a discrepancy between some of the kids. And they also should be reliable as possible. And what that means is if I were to give a different test that covered the exact same material, the child would get the similar test results. So one of the things that you're going to look at is sometimes teachers give, they'll give, let's say like a foreign language. They'll give an oral one, then they give a written test because they're really trying to find out how much that child learned about the language. And so they might give an oral one to find out how much they learn about their expressive language, and then they'll give a written one to find out how much they know about their expressive language in writing. And then they might also give a video and have the kids listen to a video, and then they'll know about how they do with multiple choice in their receptive language. So there's different types of tests that measure different types of thinking. And they should be reliable because if I'm giving one type of oral assignment, then the next time I give it or somebody else gives it in a different way, it should give me the same amount of, the same test results. And the bottom line is they should improve learning. If grades don't really make you realize what you know and what you don't know, then they're not improving learning. And that's the whole purpose. And table of specifications, as I said before, we use this. I think you have, let me go right here and look real quick. Yeah. This next slide right here is a table of specifications. When you get a textbook or you get a test bank from a textbook, typically look in the front or the back of it and you'll find your table of specifications. This should help you guide what you teach because you're going to look at it and you're going to know what questions. Okay, for question 1 is on Adam. And then the knowledge levels of rules and principles. How many questions are there on each one? And if there's multiple questions like molecular weight, look, there's 2 of them here on molecular weight. Question 17 and question 20. Ability to make applications. So we're going to make applications in compounds. We're going to make applications in chemical formula and diatomics and moles. So you have one application. So if you don't teach how to do these at an application level, then the kids are really going to struggle on that test. So when you do the evaluation of a table of specification, once you've constructed it, if you're making your own test, you should construct your own. Do the items emphasize the same concept you emphasized in your day-to-day instruction? Has an important area of the content or objective been overlooked or underemphasized? If there's something that you really hit hard, then you should have more than one question on it. And it might be at multiple levels. Does the test cover all the instructional objectives included in the lesson? Does the language of the items correspond to the language and reading level that you used in the test? So that's why it's important to teach like the vocabulary that goes along with your book and with the tests, because sometimes the kid will actually know the concept, but they introduce a new vocabulary word and the kid doesn't know what it is. Like they did a reading prompt recently with third graders, or fourth graders, I guess it was, and they had a bunch of ELL kids in there too, English language learners, and the reading prompt was something like, you are riding, or you're out with your camel. What would you see? And this one little guy said, and he was a pretty good writer, like he had actually learned to write well, and he's like, I'm with my camel. What should I see? And he didn't know what a camel was, so he pretended like it was a bicycle because he just figured it was a name brand of a bicycle. Are the instructions clear even for the students who have difficulty with instructions? Is there a reasonable balance between the items measured and the amount of time that will be required for the students to develop a response? I'm sure you've all been, witness to this. The teacher will write like 5 open-ended essays for an hour period. And you're like, really? Those are pretty, I'm writing a lot on these. And so you kind of got to balance. Am I giving them too many, like essay questions and not enough multiple choice? How many do you have to cover in a certain period of time? And whatever it takes for you to take the test, you should double that for your students. Did you write model answers or essential components for your short essays? Like, what are you looking for in there? Does the weighting of each item reflect the relative value among all the other ones? So you give an essay, a short answer, let's say, and there are 3 plausible questions. I would give that like 3 plausible answers. I'd give it 6 points instead of like a 2 point for a multiple choice question, because it's 6 points, because if there's 3 plausible explanations and they mention all 3, they get all 6 points. If they mentioned, like 2 of them and they get 1 kind of right but not completely, then they get 5 points. So you can kind of adjust it so that the relative weight, if I make all of those just 2 point, then there's 3 answers that they're giving me compared to 1 in a multiple choice test. We already talked a little bit about select response. The most common form of these are multiple choice, true, false, and matching. The selected response and correct answers appears on the test, and the student's task is to select the correct one. Talked a little bit already about short essay and long essay. Short essay are 100 words to 150. They should be a sentence or 2. I would never say a page. A short essay should be a good long paragraph. A long essay is considered to be like a 5-paragraph essay or maybe a page or 2. When we do problem solving evaluation, we talked about this already, problem organization, representation by a graph. A lot of times what they're going to do is they're going to give you a graph, or they might give you some data, and then you have to answer questions based on the data. So they're giving you some kind of scenario or data, and then you have to do that. The last part of your chapter talks about authentic and portfolio assessments and performance assessments. Portfolio assessments were really big, probably in the 80s and 90s were really big. And then my music people, you guys use performance assessment a lot in that. And some, like IB does it. My daughter just got done taking her IB exams. They do some performance assessment, especially like with... they have a rubric that they use when they're doing their orals for their language or their art. They did an art portfolio where they had to analyze their pieces of art based on a theme. So they require students to demonstrate their learning through sample works or real-world applications. A key requirement for performance grading is judicious collection of work samples from students that indicate their level of performance. So you not just take one snapshot, like in their English, in the IB, they had to meet with their professor and you had to analyze poems, right? You had poems, I'm looking at my daughter right now. You had to analyze poems, and then you had to have like this one-on-one conversation with the person about your poem. Did you have to do anything else for that? For your oral in English?
Well, that's what I talked about a novel.
Pardon me?
A novel that we read. We had to talk about.
Oh yeah, then they had to also talk about a novel that they read, and they had to have a discussion about the novel they read that went along with it. It's interesting too, like in her Spanish one that she had to do, there were, when she had to do her oral part of it, there were, I think, 4 or 5 prompts that she had to choose from. And then she could choose from one, and then she had to talk about it at first by herself, and then answer questions from her teacher that went on it. And then she was scored on a scoring rubric about how well that she used, was knowledgeable about the subject, was able to articulate it, and stuff like that went along with that. And the kids know about this ahead of time. Like, they look at the rubrics, they practice writing and performing to the rubrics. In art, when they talk about like art and other sometimes writing does portfolio assessments, the collection and evaluation of samples of student work over an extended period of time. Their art portfolios in IB are 2 years long. They begin it in their junior year, and then they end it in their senior year. And they have like an area of concentration that they're supposed to be working around, and then they have to relate it back to like different artists and different movements that go along with it, and they have to write to it in their journal. And so some people, like with writing, you might take, if it's a writing portfolio, you might take a beginning writing piece and then show how your writing has evolved throughout the year, throughout the semester. So you may collect student compositions, projects, or other evidence of higher functioning. Other districts have used portfolio assessment when kids don't do well on the FSA, the Florida State Assessment. Teachers that know that the kids they're just really poor test takers, they can actually submit a portfolio of the students' work and can move them forward or advance them to the next grade level based on a portfolio. There's scoring for performance assessments, all assignment and work is included, log sheet is completed, final reflection is completed. Some of this is like just basic stuff, but work demonstrates improvement on previous areas of weakness. So usually you're getting, when you're doing some kind of performance, you're getting feedback on it, and they're giving you kind of a degree of how well you did this. I know that's weird. This one shows excellent as the highest level. I was laughing because my music people, whenever I talk to them, they'll say, oh yeah, I got an excellent, they'll say, Dr. P, I'm so sad my students got an excellent on their, their singing performance or choral performance. And I'll say, wow, that's great, when I was first doing it. And they go, no, it's not great. It's horrible. Because excellent is bad in music. Superior is good in music. And when we look at this is partner teachers. Sometimes shows concepts are similar, shows how concepts are different. It's well organized, good opening sentence, good concluding sentence. And then we're going to look at mechanics, spelling is correct, grammar is correct, punctuation is correct. And then it's at least 2 pages. These are kind of basic. You can also, there's a lot of rubric makers. Rubistar is a really good one. If you don't want to, and it will actually give you like what a 5 is, and it gives you verbiage on it, what a 4 is, and it gives you verbiage on it. Effectiveness of performance assessment beyond all practical problems and expensive administering and scoring performance. It's time consuming. It's very time consuming, and it's laborious. We're not really sure if it solves all those problems of standardized testing, but most teachers that go through it feel as though they have a really good grip on exactly what the kids know and are able to do. Research has found that student performance on individual performance assessment could be reliably rated. But different performance assessment produce different patterns of scores. So otherwise, a kid could do really well one day, and then not the reliability of them is not good over time. It really depended, and that's one of the reasons why when you do a portfolio, you'll see multiple examples of student work. Student scores are still related more clearly to the student's aptitude than that students are actually taught. So some kids just do really well, when they're performing. Some kids can get up and talk like crazy, and other kids just freeze. So you got to kind of worry about whether or not you've catch that child on a good day. Also in the chapter, we looked at how are grades determined, and there are different ways that we can look at grades. Grading systems differ in elementary and secondary. And education, informal assessments might be more appropriate at the elementary level, whereas grades become more increasingly important at the secondary level. You go into a kindergarten class, they're not giving them A's or B's. They're giving them like pluses and minuses based on where they're doing. Grading standards can be absolute or relative. Absolute is like 90 to 100. 80 to 90 or 80 to 89. And when you do an absolute grade, what you're actually looking at is some kind of baseline of what's going on. So when I start talking about absolute grades, like you can look at a kid and say, that kids will actually, when you have absolute grades, kids will actually figure out, like my son used to do this, what do an 89.5, and they know that they round up. So he would actually figure out like what he didn't have to do in order to still get an 89.5. So when we look at that, it says, your book talks about it's this generally agreed upon need to have meaning for it. And they communicate kind of like the relative value. So was he really learning everything he needed to learn if he was figuring out just how to get that 89.5 and, like manipulating the system where, excuse me, relative grading is relative. No grade, by the way, tells you really what a kid learned. But relative grading tells you how do they relate to the other kids in the classroom. And really what relative grading, when you're doing that, is actually trying to whereby a teacher gives grades according to the student's rank in their class or their grade level. And it'll say the classic form of relative grading is specifying what percentage of students will get an A, what percentage will get a B, what percentage will get a C. And then they reserve like the D's and the F's for kids who really haven't learned enough. Like they haven't learned the baseline criteria. So if you set when you're doing a relative grading, you might set like this is the baseline, and then this is the baseline of what everybody must learn. And those kids, if you just do the baseline, you'll get a C. But from those A's to the C's, you have this mob of kids. So then you got to kind of figure out relative to the mob of kids you have, how many of them have A's, how many of them have B's, and how many have C's. I've had teachers that said, there's 22 kids in the class, only 3 of you will get A's. So it really makes it highly competitive because people are trying to, scratch their way to the top of what you're doing for that. So we're going to talk a little bit more of that. It goes on to the different parts of it. Performance grading is the way teachers determine what kids know and can do. Other systems include contract grading. I used to do that when I work with my kids in special ed. I had when I worked in high school, I had kids that they just didn't want to be there at all, but they were court ordered to be there, so they were there. And I would say to them, listen, if you do this work, this is the baseline, going back to that idea of relative grading, this is the baseline. If you can get these done, and you can get these done with 80% accuracy, these assignments, then you're going to get a C in class. And they go, really? I go, yeah, that's all you got to do. And I didn't even have them contract for D's because sometimes they're just going to fail. So they contract for a D. And then usually they get that done pretty quick. And then I'd say, look, you already got all this stuff done for a D. Look, all you have to do to get a C is X, Y, and Z. And they go, really? And so then they would do a little bit more work and then they get a C. I've had kids that contracted for a D and made it all the way up to a B. And I had kids that contracted for a C and made it up to an A. So contract grades I really liked, especially when you're working with kids who have a history of failing. Mastery grading is somewhat similar to that in the sense that you keep doing it over until you get until you're proficient and you get it all right. Report card grades typically average scores on tests, homework, seat work, class participation, deportment, and effort. Most true statisticians will tell you that you should not grade on effort. That go along with that. That should go into a conduct grade because some kids can get an A on something and have 0 effort, and some kids work really, really hard and get C's. Establishing grading criteria. So you got to ask yourself, usually they're set by a school. Grading criteria exist, but regardless of the level of school that teachers are in, they generally agree that they need to explain the meaning of the grades they give. So you'll look, like some school districts, a 93 and above is an A. And if you have a 92, you actually have a B. So you have to have some kind of communication that goes along with it. My son's at UF right now, and they don't round up. So if you have an 89.7, you have a B+. I personally round up. Grades should also help students understand better what is expected of them and how they can improve. And they can also serve as a basis for productive conversation. Like when a kid comes to you and says, like, I want an A. And I said, why did you give me a B? I just had a girl write me today. Why did you give me a C? I'm like, I didn't give you anything. Why did you earn a C? Because you're missing assignments. And this graphic right here, it's not very well printed on here, is, I'm trying to find it, hold on, is on page 373. And it kind of is psychology fair rubric. And one of the things that they look at is how many points you get for certain things. So this is like a rubric that tells you. So, and by the way, if there's anything you learn from this chapter as well, other than summative informative exams, is read your rubrics. Nothing drives me more crazy. I make rubrics for most of my classes when I have assignments that are big assignments to do. And I'll give you a rubric and it will say, you must have, like in my 265 class, you must have written down how long you think it's going to take you to do each part of your lesson. And people won't put any times in. I have to give you a 0. And it's worth like 4 points. And I have to give you a 0. So right off the bat, just because you didn't do it, I have to give you a 0. And then students lose their mind because it might be a really good lesson, but you didn't put the timing in, so I got to give you a 0. If you just looked at the rubric and looked at what everything was worth, then you would just be able to say, oh yeah, check, I got that. Check, I got that. Check, I got that. Ooh, this is really important. I might want to beef up this area. All school districts, when we assign letter grades, have some kind of policy or common practice. Usually, like if you're in a college, you can look it up in your bulletin or in your catalog, course catalog. Most use A, B, C, D, F grades, but many use various versions of outstanding, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Some people use plus and minuses systems. Some schools simply report percentage grades. I've sat on admissions committee before, we've gotten them. The child has got a 77%. They don't tell you whether that's a C or a B, it just tells you they get a 77. So the criteria on which grades are based vary enormously by district, and also by countries. When we look at performance grading, it's an alternative approach to grading that differs from letter grades. Performance gradings are usually essays, and they tell you exactly what skills the child has mastered. A key requirement is a collection of work samples so that you can back up what you say about this child's performance. Like if you say the child has mastered a certain standard, you want to have evidence that that child has mastered that objective. Performance is usually evaluated against some kind of rubric, and they describe the performance in terms of partially proficient, proficient, and advanced proficiency. In Volusia County, when you're looking at that, if you score a 70, you are partially proficient. If you score an 85, you are proficient. No, 80, you're proficient. And if you score an 88 or above, you're considered to have advanced proficiency. We also have to look at assigning report card grades. Most schools give report cards out 4 to 6 times a year, every 6 or 9 weeks. Report card grades are often derived for some combination of these factors. Scores on quizzes and tests, scores on papers and projects, scores on homework, scores on seat work, sometimes class behavior. Class participation. It shouldn't be class behavior. Most districts have not participation. What is that grade called? When you get 1s and 2s. A conduct grade, a class conduct grade. And that's the deportment, what they say. That really shouldn't fit into their regular grade. Your book doesn't talk too much about this, but it shouldn't fit into it, because when you get a letter grade like an A, B, C, D, or F, that should say whether or not you mastered the objective or whatever the standard is. So if the standard in Florida is for you to, know about Florida's involvement in the 4th grade about World War II and what was Florida's contribution to the war, that grade should reflect how much you know about that standard or those standards in social studies. It shouldn't be about whether or not you flick Susie with, a gum wrapper or something. And we'll get into that a little bit more about what's going on with that, is in chapter 14.